Працює медіа-центр Україна Укрінформ. Мене звати Світлана Чепуренко. Зараз в рамках головної дискусійної платформи країни медіа-центр Brain Hub будемо говорити про страти та катівні, які влаштовують окупанти на тимчасово окупованих українських землях. Ініціатива T4P, трибунал для Путіна, презентує 2 подання до Міжнародного кримінального суду про злочини проти людяності, які вчиняють окупанти. Представлю наших гостей. Це Ганна Овдієнко, експертка Харківської правозахисної групи, співавторка подання. Максим Ревякин, експерт Харківської правозахисної групи, співавтор подання. Владислав Доljко, юрист Харківської правозахисної групи, також співавтор подання. Наталія Яшчук, координаторка проєктів Центру громадянських свобод. І онлайн до нас приєднається Юлія Полехіна, координаторка громадської приймальні Української Гельсінської спілки з прав людини у Дніпрі та правозахисної групи SICH. Отже, перш ніж ми перейдемо до обговорення, я пропоную подивитись відео зі свідченнями тих людей, які перебували в катівнях у Бучі. Прошу.
Ми прийшли утром, а чоловік каже, у нас щось горить на вулиці. І був такий огромний стовп дима, такий, горіло. Він каже, піду подивлюся, може там необхідна допомога людям. Він пішов, а я з внуками тут поки туди-сюди завтраки і все. І буквально трошки, може, з півчаса, та ні, минут 20. І така, знаєте, автоматна або пулеметна така, очередь. І я поняла, не знаю чому, сразу я поняла, що чоловіка вбили.
Last year, I was here in Bucha in April, right after the Russians left the region. I worked in the morgue with the Ukrainian police and the Gendarmerie Nationale, Criminal Research Division. I worked in the morgues. I saw the atrocities that were committed by the Russians firsthand. It was really hard. My job was to take the unidentified bodies from the trailer. When they would come in on trailers, we would take them off and bring them into a tent to be autopsied by the French and the Ukrainian doctors. Personally, I spoke with a few of the family members. Ludmila, her husband was shot by a Russian sniper just for being out, just being outside. And then they saw him and they killed him. It was terrible. It was probably the hardest thing I've ever had to do. I'm a veteran in the United States. I've seen, victims of war and collateral damage and such and what happens in a war. But this was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Just the sheer number and sheer volumes of people that were killed and murdered. I mean, it was homicide.
Мама спілкувалася з ним, а з ним пропав зв'язок 2 березня, виключно, да? І потім він більше не виходить на зв'язок. Ми думали, що він живий, що десь знаходиться, да? І ми евакуювалися. Як тільки ми евакуювалися на Закарпаття, з'явився у мене інтернет, все у мене з'явилось, мені почали писати його друзі, що, можливо, його більше немає, тому що він пропав, не виходить на зв'язок, і його більше немає. І чули, що його спалили живцем в гаражі, там, де він переховувався.
Ви робили тест на ДНК, да? Якимось чином ви встановили цей факт?
Я робив уже 2 тести на ДНК. Зараз проводиться у мене десь слідство, тому що там опізнувати немає по чому, тому що залишилося, там був він і з ними ще 4 людей, тобто загалом було 5. Хазяйка гаража, ніхто з того даного гаража не встановлені є особами, тому що неможливо встановлювати. Це одні з перших жертв 3 числа, 3 березня, як зайшли російські військові.
Страшні свідчення. Пані Ганно, наскільки поширеними є, були і залишаються такі страти від окупантів, і взагалі скільки випадків зафіксовано зараз?
На жаль, такі випадки були досить поширеними, і це була систематична практика, яку вчиняли російські військові саме в Бучі, в Ірпіні і в найближчих населених пунктах. Цікаво те, що вона не була прямо розповсюджена по всій Київській області, по всім захопленим територіям Київської області. Вона була розповсюджена саме от на цьому фрагменті території, де зайшли певні частини, де були буряти, але не тільки вони. Це вчиняли і інші національності, інші росіяни, так скажімо. Нами зафіксовано по всій території України більше 800 випадків таких умисних вбивств, страт. У Київській області ця цифра відповідає 300. Однак, наскільки ми знаємо від правоохоронних органів, вона навіть трошки більша, на жаль. І ця практика, яка існувала, проходила по одному і тому ж сценарію постійно. Це був сценарій такий, що людина виходила з дому з будь-якою метою. Не в комендантську годину і не в годину, коли вона знала, що це заборонено. Бо дізнатися про щось, що заборонено, було неможливо. Насправді, дізнатися що-небудь було неможливо, бо не було зв'язку. Тож люди виходили з дому, думаючи, що стало трохи тихіше, купити продукти, сходити до родичів, і просто ставали жертвами снайперів. Без мотиву, без умислу вбити конкретну людину, тобто не полювали на конкретну людину. Жертвами ставали люди, які просто виходили на вулицю, і не мало значення навіть, це людина служила в АТО, ця людина мала якісь погляди, була громадським діячем. На відміну від інших регіонів, частіше за все нічого не було відомо вбивці про того, кого він вбиває. Однак найчастіше розстрілювали чоловіків. Тут була така кореляція є, що чоловіки ставали жертвами, це правда. Але крім цього параметру нічого, навіть вік чоловіка, ви чули тільки, що жінка розказувала, її чоловіку було 64 роки. Тобто він був вже літньою людиною достатньо. Він не був такою вже загрозою, яку можна було побачити від молодого. І, на жаль, ми все це зафіксували. Ми працювали останні півроку дуже-дуже тісно з правоохоронними органами. І зараз можемо сказати, що ми зібрали достатньо інформації і вивели деякі закономірності для того, щоб цю інформацію передати вже до міжнародних органів. Тому що ми бачимо, що це...
Because we can see that these are not just incidents, single sporadic cases. This was the terror committed not even against specific people who could have theoretically threatened anyone like former military personnel. This was the terror committed against the whole population and primarily male population at that. Thank you, Ms. Hanna. Mr. Maksym, you have prepared the motion, the submission to the ICC. What cases have become part of it and what evidence has been collected? Overall, this submission has included 52 cases at the national level, where in the interests of the relatives of the people dead and killed, our lawyers are working, defense lawyers, and they believe that there is enough evidence collected, enough data to identify and prove that these cases of violence had been committed by the Russian occupiers. 4 cases in Kharkiv region, 2 cases for Sumy region, 1 case in Chernihiv region, and several dozen cases in Kiev region. With reference to other regions, unfortunately, we haven't had enough time. This will be for the further update of this submission, also concerning some of the cases. We do not have access to some of the territories because they are temporarily occupied, or it is impossible to gain access of those territories due to hostilities. All of these cases cover executions with firearms or machine guns. Usually they did not pursue any logical goal that could have been recognized. There was certain recognition or differentiation in terms of the shots that were fired as extra judicial summary killings of an individual or several individuals, in some places of deployments of the military units, or some places of imprisonment, or just some executions in the streets of towns and villages. It's just when the victims would come out to find some groceries, find first aid, medication. Sometimes people would just travel in their vehicles. Even sometimes they would have white stripes on the vehicles, and the occupational authorities usually required the vehicles to have these white stripes attached to the vehicles. And still the commanders had to be aware of the actions committed by different individuals, representatives of the Russian Federation's armed forces, or sometimes they even gave such orders. Thank you, Maksym. Now, Yuliya, I would like to ask you about the situation in other regions of Ukraine. We have heard about what the people have seen in Bucha, the atrocities that they witnessed, and what about other regions? Was there any difference in terms of intensity, violence, brutality of these torture rooms and executions? Thank you. As to other regions of Ukraine, personally, with the outburst of the full-scale invasion, I began to document war crimes in Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia regions. And with the commencement of the full-scale invasion, as part of our initiative, the Tribunal for Putin, we keep recording and we keep seeing the incidents of executions of the local population in Zaporizhia region, for example. Since February 24th last year, as part of our work within this initiative, in Zaporizhia region, we identified 28 cases of intentional murder of people belonging to local population. Predominantly, these were incidents, sporadic incidents. So these were not massive or group killings. Once again, overwhelmingly people, the civilians, were killed during evacuations to safe regions. They would kill people in vehicles trying to escape. And in Zaporizhia region, we documented the killings of at least 8 people like that. Then unwillingness to cooperate with the occupiers also resulted in tragic consequences. And in Zaporizhia region, civilians during such operations were also killed, at least 2 people. We have documented something that we have identified for sure as a result of such operations. Also, some civil vehicles were injured with different kinds of armored vehicles, and 10 civilians, including 2 children, suffered as a result of that. During illegal detention in Zaporizhia region, at least 4 people were tortured to death. At least 6 people were killed in their households and their homes, including 1 house. And after they occupied a particular settlement or a village, they immediately instituted restrictions, but not everyone would know about that. But in the first place, people were not allowed to move along certain streets, were banned from being near the deployment of military units. So if they believed that somebody had violated these rules, people were immediately punishable by death. And executions were given to at least 3 people for the violation of the curfew hours, something that my fellow partners have also spoken about, when people would just go outside in daylight time, checking out on them, relatives, for example, or to go and buy something. At least 5 people have been documented to be killed. Also, the occupiers, it has been reported, for weeks wouldn't allow people to find out where the bodies of the dead people were, so they couldn't have been buried. There was another case of shooting a vehicle and the death of the driver when he was transporting some humanitarian cargo. Of course, these numbers do not reflect all of the actual information concerning Zaporizhia region in particular and the number of the victims. I would like to provide you with some of the information from Tokmak, a lady that managed to escape this territory. She said that after a while, after the occupation started, the occupiers began to look for ex-participants of the anti-terrorist operation, the ex-combatants were taken out of their homes and they would never come back. They were detained in the occupied Palace of Culture, and a lot of these young guys had their legs shot through. So these were former military personnel, and then some of them would just go missing without a trace. And sometimes people were killed in the presence of this lady, and she said that after the beginning of the curfew, if anyone was driving along the roads, these cars were immediately shot together with the people sitting in them. She said that the mortuaries and morgues, they were full of dead bodies. This was at the time when she was still in occupation, and the occupiers wouldn't allow the dead bodies to be buried. And then she witnessed that to Tokmak, they brought a crematorium, a mobile one, and there were some cases when the corpses of people were burned in this portable vehicle. And this car was placed in the territory of some kind of a hospital. So she said that for a while this automobile remained there in order to burn the remnants of the people dead. And she said that a lot of people had been killed, and there was a whole lot of destroyed vehicles in Tokmak town. Unfortunately, this place still remains under occupation until now. The connection is choppy. So it's impossible to document the rest of these cases for us. The majority of the deoccupied villages and towns, the majority of the villages occupied, they immediately wanted to identify who were the people, if they were military, if these people had been ex-combatants, if they had taken part in the anti-terrorist operation in the east of Ukraine. They didn't even require any minimal evidence. These people were immediately apprehended and detained and sometimes killed. I also found information in the International Independent Commission at the UN as of March 2023. There is certain evidence laid out concerning intentional murders committed by the Russian troops. Even some people who couldn't possibly move, who were not military personnel, and this was evidence that people were deprived of their right to light, and this was illegal. So this commission identified common elements. So these are the regularities that we have been able to identify, and it runs along the lines of the UN report. So the extrajudicial summary killings, the attackers usually would attack the people if they even imagined that these individuals could have supported the Ukrainian armed forces. And the Russian troops committed intentional murders as part of searches of the premises in order to identify the so-called proponents of the Ukrainian armed forces, or even just for the fact of finding some arms in the premises. So as of now, the statistics that I have provided you with concerning Zaporizhzhia region, of course, cannot reflect fully the relevant information, given the fact that Zaporizhzhia region itself is inaccessible for us to continue documenting, identify the evidence that relates to war crimes, because the large chunk of this territory still remains under occupation. Therefore, as of now, this is the information that we possess. Thank you, Ms. Yuliya. Ms. Hanna, you have collected a huge mass of evidence, and this has been part of the submission. Why is it necessary to restore justice, to bring to account the people culpable of these atrocities? What are you expecting as a result of the submissions? In the first place, I should say that there hasn't been made a single submission to the International Criminal Court, as far as we know, concerning the intentional murders and the murders committed in Bucha and Bucha region. Therefore, it matters. Therefore, everyone knows what has happened in Kiev region. However, so far, Once again, no submissions have been filed with the international authorities. But why is it important at the International Criminal Court, for example? The answer is very plain and simple, because proceedings will be initiated based on this particular fact of submission, just as it has been done against Lvova Belova and Putin with reference to kidnapping Ukrainian children. And we very much hope that similar submissions will become the starting point for criminal proceedings for the ICC to investigate them further, and it will be up to the ICC and its investigators to hold investigative actions together with our customers, with our clients, the survivors, and this will definitely gain more public information and dissemination. Before we move on to the next part, I would like us to watch another video with the testimonials of the people who have witnessed all of these tortures and became witnesses of executions in Kharkiv region. Please play the video. There is an enterprise, and there was a premise, isolated premises in this enterprise that were used as detention chambers, and part of those chambers and premises were also used for interrogations. And in those premises or chambers nearby this enterprise, there was a bridge and there was a checkpoint that people had to go through and cross it. And if they didn't like someone, regardless of their age, sex, they were immediately dragged for interviews. Sometimes there were any reasons I dislike you, I have suspicions against you, therefore cross-examination was immediately organized for these people. Some of these people would stay there for days and days, and they were examined, cross-examined, executed in order to gain some information from them. They would like to inquire the whereabouts of ex-combatants, the former participants in the anti-terrorist operation. So in many ways, this was like a full-scale concentration camp. These were interested in nationalistically minded people, ATO participants, representatives of local authorities, teachers. In order for you to understand this list, even a priest was apprehended, and 3 days he stayed there, and they electrocuted him for 3 days. Boys, girls, everyone, men, women, all of the walks of life, representatives of population. There was no segmentation into categories. Everything that could have been Ukrainian was a taboo for them. Mr. Vladyslav, in summary, if we sum up all of the evidence, what happened in these torture rooms in Kharkiv region, in the basements, and what kind of evidence has become part of your submission, has become foundation for that? Hello? Good afternoon. In the first place, let me state that when talking about this submission, we talk about the corpus delicti of an international crime, which is part of the Rome statute under the International Criminal Code, and it's all about the deprivation of liberty. Why is it important within the scope of the war crimes? Because it was targeted against the civilian population, and we believe, our Kharkiv human rights group believe that just because these Ukrainians were taken prisoner indiscriminately within the full-scale aggression of the Russian Federation, it's not only cases of crime against humanity, but these are individual cases of torture, and within these submissions we're talking about very stiff regime in interconnection with other atrocity crimes, because the so-called cross-examinations and interrogations, which have nothing to do with the interrogations or interviews as part of the criminal investigation, because as an actual fact we identified these were tortures when civilians were apprehended against their will, and they were tortured in nearly every individual case. And there you can read in the testimonials of the survivors, you can read about the fact that they had been beaten, battered, electrocuted. There were attempts made at cutting off parts of their body. Methodical incisions were made on their bodies. Mock executions were tried against them, and different kinds of horrific things applied during the so-called interrogations when people were deprived of freedom. And these captives would be kept for months, days, weeks in cellars where there was no daylight. They were not fed. They couldn't go to the toilet. There was just a bucket for them to go instead of a toilet. And usually they would be put on a sack on their head if they took them outside. And people, of course, had handcuffs on their hands. So our Kharkiv human rights group, within the database for the T4P, we had more than 200 such cases documented, and 23 cases have been included in this submission, because these are very well documented pieces of evidence concerning the places of imprisonment, in particular with very detailed descriptions of those imprisonment places. Talking about the submission, our group also presents the evidence about 9 such places of imprisonment organized by the occupiers in the temporarily occupied territory of Kharkiv region. This is direct evidence. Along with that, in our submission, we also have specific evidence documented from the open sources that at the time of the preparation of these submissions also allowed us to understand information and about 23 such torture chambers. So concerning the temporarily occupied territories in Kharkiv region, the army of occupiers had 2-level chamber rooms and detention torture chambers. So the troops of the Russian army would detain people for a relatively short period of time, and they had primary interviews with them, and then they would make further decisions concerning whether or not they would have to keep them repeatedly or they would have to discharge them. In order to bring those culpable of these cases, we have the information about the 13 individuals that we simply know that are perpetrators of these crimes, and we know this information is definitely true. This information has already been submitted to the prosecutor of the ICC. In summary of this presentation, let me say that the Kharkiv Human Rights Group and our partners continue documenting information about detention, keeping people captive, and tortures by the representatives of the occupiers. And a lot of this information is being passed on to the ICC, and you can be familiarized with the full information and get yourselves familiarized concerning the mechanisms which are available to bring such culpable persons to account. Thank you. Ms. Nataliya, what other places of harsh detention have been documented in the regions that you investigated? What else have you found out? Because I'm a documenter of war crimes in Kiev region, I respectively know a lot more information about Kiev region, and all of these places are very well known. I mean, Bucha, Irpin, Gostomel. In Bucha, it was a children's camp where the occupying forces set up their torture room. In Gostomel, these were freezing rooms where they would torture people. In Dnipro, for example, this was an enterprise of Windows land where they detained people and tortured them. However, occupying forces managed even to set up torture chambers even in villages, where they would detain 2 or 3 people at a time. In the first place, of course, they tortured them, and unfortunately, regrettably, part of these people died as a result of this torture. Another part of them were moved to other places of imprisonment, either in the territory of the Russian Federation or in the temporarily occupied territories in Donetsk and Lugansk regions. As my colleagues have already mentioned, we may have managed to document and identify such cases in Kiev, Kherson, Zaporizhia, horrible cases of atrocities and tortures that our people unfortunately had to undergo, and the violence and brutality was incredible. They wouldn't just use stun guns, they would use dynamo machines. They would attach current to people's skin. They would not let people eat anything for days and weeks. There were even some cases that during one day, people would give them a spoonful of jam, in best case. 2 or 3 days, they wouldn't give them any water. As Vladyslav has said, there was a place where people could go and defecate or urinate, like a bucket, for example. But these were common places for both men and women. So this is also a kind of sexual violence, gender-based violence. There were also mock execution cases identified. Along with that, there were instances when the occupying forces would enter a particular village, set up a torture chamber, and would just shoot at the walls, and sometimes these bullets would hit the people that were just placed nearby the walls, and this of course resulted in people's being wounded or being killed instantly. Also, we have some testimony of civilians in Kiev region. Again, I'm not going to identify the village where 3 people were detained, and they were used as a human shield. What does that mean? People were brought to a private house, placed them in a kind of a semi-basement, in a cellar, which was not protected from shelling. After that, they would put a tank from which they would shoot at another village, and the people detained in this basement would understand that right now the opposite side would start shooting, and the shots were fired. And unfortunately, during this documenting, we came to realize and understand that one of the people was tortured to death, had been tortured to death, and was not even buried, but thrown in a well. So these were systemic methods employed by the occupiers, not only in Kiev region, but in other territories likewise. For that, they used not only schools, the premises of schools, not only the buildings of clubs, but even private houses, barns, sheds. Also, they used freezing chambers and basements in private buildings, where the greatest number of tortures took place. In Velika community, we documented the case of 2 men being battered to death. Afterwards, in the midst of the people abducted, not just from the street in the broad daylight. Sometimes these people were abducted from their private homes as they would go along the street or go into work. In the first place, these people were tortured in the places completely inadequate for detaining people there. And later on, we came to understand that 4,100 people were transported to the territory of the Russian Federation and the temporarily occupied territories, and now are illegally detained in imprisonment. Also, there is another case documented when a civilian was bound to a tree and for more than 2 days kept this person in cold, without feeding, splashing cold water on this man or on this woman for 2 days, and eventually this person was taken in the territory of the Russian Federation. Thank you. This is heinous to hear about such atrocities. Dear colleagues, do you have any specific names of the culpable people? What is the final end? What's the end game of this submission? Would you like to bring Putin and his supreme leadership to account, as well as military leadership to account? Or do you have an intention to hold accountable specific people who issued these orders and the perpetrators of these crimes? In our submission, there is information contained, because we are talking about 2 submissions to the ICC on crimes against humanity. We had also prepared information prior to that concerning alleged 13 perpetrators. This information has been gathered from different sources, but let us say the primary source, of course, is the witness accounts of the people tortured, and they would hear the nicknames, they would see the faces of these people. A lot of these culpable individuals were recognized from photographs, etc. So this information also came from other sources, because we have found information from open sources, and all of this has been submitted with the International Criminal Court, so that hopefully these individuals will be brought to account. Thank you. Dear colleagues, are there any questions to our guests? Good afternoon. Tkachuk Svetlana, Ukrinform. I have one clarification question and one broader question, if I may. Ms. Svetlana basically has already outlined some of the questions. The first clarification: how long did it take you to collect all of this evidence and process it prior to submission? And another question is that the ICC cannot have crimes in absentia. So what are your prospects? What are your assessments of the prospects concerning the culpable people being brought to account in the presence of the International Criminal Court? Thank you. Let me try to answer your question. Concerning the first part of your question, speaking about the submissions with reference to inhumane imprisonment, the massive information which became foundational for the submission, what has been documented since the 24th of February through the 31st of March 2022. And as of now, quite a lengthy amount of time has taken place since March last year. And all of this time has been necessary in order to process all of this information collected, to verify, find something additional, hold consultations from the standpoint of legal aspects. I participated personally in the conference at the International Criminal Court in summer this year in order to find out what specific information was necessary to speak to the individuals who are employed in this court, what information would be most useful for them to obtain, so that our work could be targeted at the end game, at the final purpose. We try to identify what exactly we want, but they will also be authorized to hold their own investigations. And our idea is to show them the specific directions in order to expedite, to speed up such investigations. Concerning the part of your question that they don't have trials in absentia, this is another extremely important aspect of this court's criminal activity. We always keep saying, we need to win. We will win, and we will definitely bring all of the culpable persons to account. Concerning the second question, yes, of course, at the ICC, they don't have trials in absentia, but there is also a big time that is necessary to conduct investigations, and this is usually done by the prosecutors at the ICC, and this can be done without the availability of the culpable persons, and serve them with special documents, like it was in case with Lvova Belova and Putin. So this is already important. Everything that we are doing, of course, regards the commanders of military units, because according to the international criminal law, these commanders have to be brought to account. And like we know it from practice on former Yugoslavia tribunals, people who were responsible for issuing such orders or who were aware of such criminal acts and could have repressed them from committing such atrocities, then these military personnel must also be held accountable. Thank you. Are there any more questions to our guests? Let me add concerning the second part. Yes, please. May I? Do we still have time? Yes, of course. Go ahead. My point is that we try to remember the principle of universal jurisdiction, that prosecution will take place. Other countries can also investigate international crimes regardless of their geography, the place where they were committed, where the alleged criminals may be, or what citizenship they are, because this is a huge threat to the international security. And criminal prosecution by other countries is usually initiated immediately if a victim or a survivor or the perpetrator belong to this particular country. And as of now, because I haven't been getting ready for this question, but as far as I know, about 150 countries have already implemented the mechanism of universal jurisdiction. These norms of the international humanitarian law have been implemented by them. War crimes do not have the statute of limitation, are not subject of statute of limitations. Therefore, joining the words of my colleagues, everything that we are doing today is meant for the next stage. We're doing all we can right now, but this universal jurisdiction will definitely prove very helpful to us. Thank you. Thank you to our colleagues, and we very much believe that all of the culpable individuals will definitely be brought to account, and Media Ukrinform Center will continue its work at 1400 hours. We'll continue talking about kidnapping, abduction of people in local regions, and human rights activists will also tell us about the kidnap by the Russian authorities from the local government. Please stay with us and see you at 2 o'clock.